Château Thierry, France, June 4, 1918, 0200 hours, and Helen Fairchild, a 26-year-old nurse from Pennsylvania wearing the white uniform and Red Cross armband of the American Red Cross Nursing Service, stands in a field hospital tent that smells of gangrene, chloroform and death, watching as another ambulance arrives carrying American casualties from the fighting that has transformed this sector of the Marne into a slaughterhouse. Fairchild has been in France for 11 months, long enough to have developed the mechanical efficiency required to function when faced with wounds that would have made her vomit during training, long enough to know which soldiers will survive and which are dying no matter what she does, long enough to understand that modern warfare produces injuries that challenge every assumption about what the human body can endure and what medical science can repair. What Fairchild cannot possibly know as she prepares to receive the latest batch of shattered men is that within 3 months she will be dead, not from German shells or gas, but from exposure to mustard gas and the jaundice that followed. One of hundreds of American nurses who will die serving in France, casualties of a war that theoretically kept women away from the front lines, but in practice put them directly in the path of artillery, aircraft and chemical weapons that made no distinction between combatants and medical personnel. The American Red Cross Nursing Service that deployed to France beginning in 1917 represented both a triumph of professional organisation and a revolutionary transformation of women's role in warfare. When America declared war in April 1917, the Army Nurse Corps numbered fewer than 400 active duty nurses, utterly inadequate for the massive casualties expected from modern combat. The Red Cross, which had been training and certifying nurses since the Spanish-American War, maintained rosters of over 8,000 graduate nurses ready for military service, creating a reserve force that could be mobilised rapidly. Jane Delano, the director of the Red Cross Nursing Service and superintendent of the Army Nurse Corps, understood that America would need thousands of nurses in France, and that recruiting, training and deploying them would require organisation on a scale unprecedented for women's service. Within weeks of the declaration of war, Delano had initiated recruitment campaigns that would eventually see over 20,000 American nurses serve overseas, the largest deployment of professional women in military service in history to that point. The nurses who volunteered for overseas service came from backgrounds that would have been unthinkable for military nurses a generation earlier. Helen Fairchild had graduated from Pennsylvania Hospital School of Nursing in 1913, part of a new generation of professionally trained nurses who viewed their work as a career rather than simply an extension of women's natural caring role. Julia Stimpson, who would become chief nurse of the American Expeditionary Forces, held a degree from Vassar and came from a prominent St. Louis family, demonstrating that nursing had become respectable even for women of social standing. Beatrice MacDonald from Connecticut had worked in New York hospitals for 5 years before volunteering, bringing practical experience with trauma and surgical nursing that would prove invaluable in field hospitals. These women were not naive volunteers seeking adventure, but trained professionals who understood they were entering a war zone where their skills would be tested under conditions their training barely prepared them for. The journey to France tested the nurses before they ever reached their assignments, as the voyage across the Atlantic exposed them to the same submarine threats that threatened troop transports. The SS Mongolia, carrying a contingent of Red Cross nurses in May 1917, was attacked by a U-boat, the torpedo passing close enough that nurses on deck could see its wake. The near miss a reminder that women serving overseas faced dangers from the moment they left American ports. The nurses travelling to France were officially non-combatants under international law, their status protected by the Geneva Convention. But German submarines hunting Allied shipping made no distinction between military and medical vessels when targets presented themselves. The nurses learned to sleep in life jackets, to know where their lifeboat stations were, to accept that they might drown in the Atlantic before ever reaching France, mortality that came with overseas service regardless of gender. The arrival in French ports introduced the nurses to conditions that violated every assumption about proper medical facilities, as they found themselves assigned to hospitals that ranged from requisitioned chateaus to tents in muddy fields, to railway cars converted into mobile surgical units. Base Hospital No. 5, staffed by personnel from Harvard Medical School and affiliated hospitals, operated in a former casino in Boulogne, the elegant ballrooms converted into surgical theatres and recovery wards. Base Hospital No. 4, organised by Lakeside Hospital in Cleveland, functioned from tents on the grounds of a chateau outside Chalon-sur-Marne, providing surgical care only miles from active fighting. The nurses assigned to mobile surgical units traveled with advancing or retreating armies, setting up and breaking down hospitals in hours, learning to work in conditions that bore no resemblance to the spotless, well-equipped hospitals where they had trained. The medical challenges the nurses faced in France exceeded anything civilian nursing had prepared them for, as they encountered wounds produced by high-explosive shells, machine gun bullets, gas exposure, and the infections that inevitably followed in conditions where sterility was a goal rarely achieved. A single artillery barrage could produce dozens of casualties requiring immediate surgery, men arriving with limbs attached by threads of tissue, abdomens torn open by shell fragments, faces destroyed by explosions that occurred at point-blank range. The nurses learned to perform triage, making split-second decisions about which patients needed immediate surgery, which could wait, which were too badly injured to save given limited resources. The decisions haunted them because choosing to focus on one patient meant abandoning another who might have survived, with attention, moral calculations that transformed nursing from caring profession into a grim calculus of resource allocation. The gas casualties proved particularly horrific as nurses encountered injuries that had no civilian equivalent, men whose lungs had been destroyed by chlorine or phosgene, whose skin had been burned by mustard gas, whose eyes had been blinded by chemical weapons that added new dimensions of horror to warfare. The treatment for gas injuries remained primitive in 1918, largely supportive care while waiting to see if the patient's body could recover from damage that ranged from temporary irritation to permanent disability or death. Nurses caring for gas patients described the sounds of men drowning in their own fluids, coughing up pieces of their lungs, begging for relief that morphine could only partially provide. The mustard gas cases were particularly distressing because the injuries appeared slowly, men arriving at hospitals apparently unharmed only to develop massive blisters hours later, the skin sloughing off in sheets, the eyes swelling shut, the lungs filling with fluid as the chemical weapon did its work. The surgical nursing required skills beyond what the nurses had learned in American hospitals, as the scale and severity of wounds demanded efficiency that prioritized saving lives over patient comfort or conventional medical procedures. French military surgeons, hardened by 4 years of combat casualties, taught American nurses to work faster, to assist with amputations that took minutes rather than the careful procedures taught in peacetime, to accept that some standards of nursing care were luxuries that field hospitals could not afford. The nurses learned to administer anesthesia, a role typically reserved for physicians, because the volume of casualties required that anyone with basic competence handle whatever tasks needed doing. They learned to debride wounds, cutting away dead and infected tissue with confidence that would have horrified their instructors, because field conditions required aggressive treatment that couldn't wait for ideal sterile conditions. The emotional toll of caring for dying men, most barely older than the nurses themselves, created psychological burdens that the nursing profession had no framework for addressing. Helen Fairchild's letters home described the nightly ritual of going through the wards, knowing that some of the men she was saying goodnight to would be dead by morning, feeling helpless despite all her training and effort. The nurses developed dark humor as coping mechanism, jokes about death and dismemberment that would have seemed monstrous in civilian contexts, but served as psychological armor against constant exposure to suffering. They learned to maintain professional demeanor while changing dressings on wounds that filled the ward with the smell of rotting flesh, while holding the hands of dying boys who called for mothers the nurses could not summon, while watching young men realize they would spend the rest of their lives missing arms or legs or faces. The relationship between nurses and wounded soldiers developed its own complex dynamics, as the men viewed the nurses as symbols of home, of civilization, of femininity, in an environment dominated by masculine violence. The simple presence of women in field hospitals provided comfort beyond medical treatment, reminding soldiers that a world existed beyond trenches and killing, that gentleness and care still had place even in war. The soldiers called the nurses angels, wrote letters home describing their kindness, created romanticized images that ignored the blood on their uniforms and the exhaustion in their eyes. The nurses accepted these characterizations because they served useful purpose. If soldiers found comfort in viewing them as angels, rather than professional women doing difficult work under terrible conditions, then playing that role was another form of care they could provide. The reality behind the angelic image was considerably more complex as the nurses developed professional identities that combined traditional feminine caring with authority and competence that challenged gender norms. Julia Stimson, as chief nurse of the AEF, commanded thousands of nurses, and made decisions about hospital operations, demonstrating administrative that would have been remarkable in any context. The nurses learned to give orders to enlisted men serving as orderlies and medical assistants, exercising authority that violated peacetime social norms about women's proper role. They worked alongside male physicians as colleagues rather than subordinates, their professional expertise respected even as military regulations officially placed them in ambiguous positions that granted officer privileges without officer rank. The living conditions for nurses varied wildly depending on assignment, but rarely met standards they had known in American hospitals. Those serving in base hospitals behind the lines enjoyed relative comfort, sleeping in actual buildings, eating in mess halls, having access to bathing facilities and clean uniforms. The nurses assigned to field hospitals near the front lived in tents that provided minimal protection from weather, slept on cots in quarters that never seemed warm or dry, ate food that was always cold by the time it reached medical units, wore uniforms that stayed dirty because laundry facilities didn't exist. The mobile surgical units travelled with armies, their nurses sleeping in whatever shelter could be found, sometimes railway cars, sometimes abandoned buildings, sometimes tents pitched in the open, always ready to move on hours' notice. The danger the nurses faced came not just from enemy action, but from the diseases that thrived in wartime conditions where sanitation was difficult and exposure to infected patients was constant. Influenza swept through American forces in 1918, killing more Americans than combat, overwhelming hospitals where nurses worked 18-hour shifts caring for patients who died faster than their bodies could be removed. The nurses themselves fell sick at alarming rates, their immune systems compromised by exhaustion and constant exposure, many developing pneumonia that was often fatal in an era before antibiotics. Helen Fairchild's death from complications following gas exposure illustrated how medical personnel could become casualties even when not directly targeted. The gas that damaged her liver coming from treating patients who had been gassed, making her death a direct result of her nursing service, even though she was never on a battlefield. The German Spring Offensive of 1918 tested the nurses as military medical facilities had to evacuate ahead of advancing enemy forces, packing patients who could travel while leaving those too injured to move to German capture. The nurses at field hospitals near Château Thierry worked through the night preparing patients for evacuation, performing emergency surgeries on men who couldn't survive transport, making terrible decisions about who would be saved and who would be abandoned. The German advance brought enemy shellfire close enough to hit hospital areas, violating the theoretical protection that medical facilities enjoyed, killing patients and staff who thought themselves safe behind the lines. Several nurses died during the German offensive, caught by artillery while evacuating or killed when hospitals received direct hits, their deaths demonstrating that the front line in modern warfare was wherever enemy shells could reach. The American counteroffensive that followed saw nurses advancing with the troops, setting up field hospitals in buildings that had been occupied by Germans days before, treating casualties in facilities that still showed signs of recent combat. The nurses working these forward hospitals operated under conditions that made proper medical care almost impossible, performing surgeries with limited supplies, treating infections without adequate medicines, watching men die from wounds that would have been survivable with the resources available at base hospitals. The proximity to fighting meant constant awareness that the military situation could deteriorate rapidly, that evacuation might be necessary with minimal warning, that enemy counterattacks could overrun their positions, adding fear for personal safety to the already overwhelming stress of caring for catastrophically wounded men. The Meuse-Argonne offensive beginning September 1918 produced American casualties on a scale that overwhelmed medical facilities, despite all the preparation and expansion of nursing service. The field hospitals and base hospitals filled beyond capacity as ambulances arrived continuously, with men torn apart by German artillery and machine guns. The nurses worked shifts that stretched 20 and 30 hours, sleeping in snatches between surgical cases, eating when someone remembered to bring them food, living in a haze of exhaustion, punctuated by moments of absolute clarity when split-second decisions meant life or death for their patients. Julia Stimson described the offensive as revealing both the best and worst of military nursing, the incredible competence nurses demonstrated under impossible conditions balanced against the tragic reality that many men died for lack of resources rather than lack of care. The armistice on November 11, 1918, did not end the nurses' work as hospitals remained full of wounded men requiring months of treatment and evacuation. The influenza pandemic that had begun during the fall intensified after the armistice, filling wards with soldiers who had survived combat only to be struck down by disease. The nurses continued working through the winter of 1918 to 1919, caring for patients in hospitals that transitioned from emergency facilities to convalescent centres, helping men prepare for the long voyages home or for discharge in France if their injuries made immediate travel impossible. The emotional letdown after the armistice proved difficult for many nurses who found that peace removed the sense of urgent purpose that had sustained them through the worst conditions, leaving them to confront the accumulated psychological trauma of a year or more of service. The return to America brought its own challenges as the nurses struggled to explain their experiences to family and friends who had no framework for understanding what military nursing had entailed. The returning nurses were honoured in parades and celebrations that portrayed them as angels and heroines, characterizations that felt hollow to women who remembered the smell of gangrene, the sounds of dying men, the feeling of complete helplessness when faced with injuries they could not repair. The professional recognition they had enjoyed in France disappeared rapidly in post-war America as they returned to hospital hierarchies where male physicians held all authority and nurses were expected to be deferential assistants rather than the competent professionals they had proven themselves to be overseas. The psychological scars the nurses carried proved as lasting as any physical injuries, as many suffered from what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though no such diagnosis existed in 1919. Nightmares about dying patients persisted for years, triggered by sounds or smells that recalled hospital wards. Some nurses found it impossible to return to civilian nursing, the routine care of peacetime patients seeming meaningless after treating battlefield casualties. Others threw themselves into nursing careers with intensity that suggested they were trying to prove something, or perhaps atone for the men they couldn't save. A few, like Helen Fairchild's colleagues, spent the rest of their lives ensuring that the nurses who died overseas were not forgotten, creating memorials and histories that documented their service. The legacy of the Red Cross nurses who served in France extended far beyond their individual experiences as their service transformed American nursing and demonstrated women's capability for professional work under the most demanding conditions. The post-war expansion of nursing education and professionalization drew directly on the reputation the military nurses had earned, their competence under pressure silencing critics who had questioned whether women could handle the physical and emotional demands of serious medical work. The establishment of the Army Nurse Corps as permanent military organization with clear rank structure and benefits reflected recognition that professional nurses were essential military assets rather than civilian volunteers temporarily attached to the army. The statistical record of American nursing service in France tells a story of massive mobilization and sacrifice that often gets lost in the broader narrative of American participation in World War I. Over 20,000 American nurses served overseas during the war, the vast majority with the Red Cross. Over 200 nurses died in service, some from enemy action, most from disease and the occupational hazards of caring for casualties in primitive conditions. Nurses treated over 300,000 American casualties in France, performing work that required not just medical competence, but physical stamina and emotional resilience that challenged assumptions about women's capabilities. The letters and diaries they left provide some of the most vivid accounts of what American military medicine faced in France, descriptions of wounds and treatments and conditions that official military reports sanitized for public consumption. The relationship between the nurses' service and the broader women's suffrage movement proved complex as the nurses themselves generally avoided political activism, viewing their role as professional rather than political. Yet their service provided powerful ammunition for suffrage advocates who argued that women who could handle military nursing deserved the right to vote, that competence demonstrated under war conditions proved women's equality with men in ways that abstract arguments could not. The passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920 owed something to the nurses who served in France, though most of those nurses would have been uncomfortable with the suggestion that their medical service had political implications. The memorialization of the nurses took various forms in the decades following the war, as colleagues and family members worked to ensure their service was not forgotten. The Red Cross Nurse Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery, dedicated in 1938, honors all nurses who served in American wars, but draws particular inspiration from World War I service. Individual hospitals and nursing schools created their own memorials, plaques and monuments listing the names of nurses who served and died. Helen Fairchild became symbol of nurses who gave their lives in service, her story told and retold as example of dedication and sacrifice, though the telling often sanitized the harsh realities of her death and the failures of military medicine that contributed to it. The nurses who survived and returned home carried their experiences throughout lives that often included continued service to nursing profession and veterans. Julia Stimson became president of the American Nurses Association, using her prominence to advocate for professional advancement. Many veteran nurses remained active in Red Cross, serving in disaster relief and preparing for potential future military service. Some became nursing educators, training the next generation and ensuring that lessons learned in France were not lost. A few wrote memoirs, though most found it difficult to capture in words what their service had entailed, the gap between experience and expression proving too wide to bridge satisfactorily. The technological and medical advances that followed World War I owed much to lessons learned treating battlefield casualties, with nurses' practical experience contributing to improvements in surgical technique, infection control, and trauma management. The recognition that immediate surgical intervention saved lives led to development of forward surgical hospitals in World War II, concept pioneered by the mobile surgical units in World War I, where nurses had demonstrated that quality medical care could be provided in field conditions. The understanding that psychological trauma affected medical personnel as much as combat troops, though not formally acknowledged until much later, drew partly on the experiences of nurses who had shown signs of what would now be called compassion fatigue and secondary traumatic stress. The question of whether the nurses should have been given formal military rank remained controversial for decades, as the nurses had enjoyed officer privileges without officer rank, an ambiguous status that reflected uncertainty about women's place in military hierarchy. The nurses themselves generally supported formal rank, believing it would provide both recognition and authority needed to perform their duties effectively. Military leadership resisted, concerned that commissioning women as officers would set precedent with implications beyond nursing. The compromise that eventually emerged gave nurses officer rank, but in a separate category from male officers, maintaining distinction that reflected persistent discomfort with women in military roles. The comparison between American and Allied nursing services revealed both similarities and differences in how different nations deployed women in military roles. British nurses served in conditions similar to Americans, facing the same dangers and challenges, though British military nursing had longer tradition dating to the Crimean War and Florence Nightingale. French nurses operated under different cultural assumptions about women's roles, often drawn from religious orders and lacking the professional training American nurses brought. German nurses served in military hospitals but rarely as close to front lines as American and British nurses, reflecting different doctrines about proper placement of medical facilities. The international nature of nursing service, with women from multiple nations caring for wounded, regardless of nationality when circumstances allowed, created bonds that transcended national divisions. The lasting impact on individual nurses varied widely, as some integrated their service into life narratives that included military nursing as important but not defining experience, while others found that France had changed them in ways they could never fully process or overcome. The letters Helen Fairchild wrote home during her months in France show progressive transformation from optimistic volunteer to hardened professional to exhausted caregiver, barely hanging on, trajectory that many nurses followed. The final letters, written when she was already sick, expressed both satisfaction at having served and awareness that the service was costing more than she had anticipated, recognition that sometimes the price of caring for others was one's own health and ultimately life. The recognition that modern warfare required massive medical infrastructure, including thousands of trained nurses, became principle of American military planning after World War I, ensuring that future conflicts would see even larger deployments of medical personnel. The nurses who served in France had proven the concept, demonstrating that professional women could function effectively in military medical system, that their presence improved morale beyond their direct medical contributions, that they could endure hardship and danger that many male officers had assumed women incapable of handling. The army that went to war in 1941 included nursing corps that traced lineage and traditions directly to the women who had served in France, benefiting from lessons learned at tremendous cost by that earlier generation. The story of the Red Cross nurses in World War I remains one of professional women confronting unprecedented challenges and proving capable in ways that expanded possibilities for women in military service and civilian nursing. Helen Fairchild and the thousands like her went to France as trained professionals, performed demanding work under conditions that tested their limits, and demonstrated that competence transcended gender when lives were at stake. Some paid with their lives, casualties of a war that theoretically kept women away from danger, but in practice exposed them to the same shells, gas, and disease that killed soldiers. Their service challenged assumptions about women's proper roles, contributed to women's suffrage, and transformed nursing into a profession that could claim equality with any other based on the competence demonstrated under fire in French field hospitals. The white uniforms and Red Cross armbands they wore became symbols of American medical care, of feminine strength under pressure, and of sacrifice that asked nothing more than recognition that their work mattered and their service would be remembered. The angels of mercy that popular mythology created bore little resemblance to the exhausted, competent professionals who actually served, but perhaps that gap between myth and reality is itself testament to how profoundly their service challenged expectations about what women could endure and achieve when necessity demanded and opportunity allowed.